Lowell and David Hartman were the couple everyone admired, young, engaged, and seemingly destined for a lifetime of happiness until one October night, when a drug-fueled spiral inside their quiet Vermont home ended with David's brutal death and Emma confessing to a crime she swore she couldn't fully remember. Lowell and David Hartman were the type of couple that drew attention without even trying. When people saw them together, walking hand in hand down the main street of their small Vermont town, they seemed untouchable, as though nothing could ever break the bond they shared. Emma was quiet, thoughtful, and known for her soft smile, while David was adventurous, charismatic, and always eager to try something new. They balanced each other in a way that made outsiders believe they were destined to spend their lives together. Their love story began years earlier in a crowded college library when David struck up a conversation about the book Emma was reading. From that moment, their paths seemed tied together by something greater than chance. Over the years, their relationship only deepened. They traveled through Europe on backpacking trips, hiked the mountains of Colorado, and filled Emma's photo albums with memories of sunsets, laughter, and the kind of affection people often envy. When David proposed during a camping trip in Maine, Emma said yes without hesitation. Friends recalled how she beamed with joy, flashing her engagement ring with pride. Her parents spoke of David as if he were already part of the family. For all who knew them, the engagement felt like a natural step in a love story that was moving exactly as it should. The couple eventually settled in a 2-story house on the edge of the forest. It was a cozy place with peeling white paint and a porch swing that overlooked a field of wild flowers in the summer. To Emma, it felt safe, almost magical. To David, it offered the kind of seclusion he craved after years of traveling. Their home became a gathering spot for friends on weekends, filled with the smell of barbecues and the sound of music drifting across the yard. The locals would wave when they drove by, noting how happy the young couple always seemed. Yet beneath the surface, small cracks had begun to show. Emma's friends noticed her growing quietness when David wasn't around. She had always struggled with anxiety, often worrying about things others considered minor. David, in contrast, thrived on excitement and pushed for new experiences. He was fascinated by pushing limits, whether that meant climbing higher peaks, driving faster cars, or dabbling with mind-altering substances. Emma rarely shared his enthusiasm for these adventures, but she often followed along, not wanting to disappoint him. Those who knew her best suspected that Emma sometimes felt trapped between wanting to please David and needing to protect herself from situations that made her uneasy. Still, she rarely voiced those concerns. To most people, the couple remained an image of perfection, a reminder that true love was possible in a world where relationships often fell apart. Their engagement, their home, and their shared plans for the future painted a picture of stability and joy. But even the most beautiful portraits can hide shadows in the background. Emma and David's story, which began with so much promise, was inching closer to a turning point that no one could have predicted. The love that seemed unshakable would soon be tested in ways that neither of them could survive, and the house by the forest that once looked like a dream would become the scene of a nightmare. The night that would change everything began quietly, almost peacefully. The October air was sharp with the scent of fallen leaves, and the sky above their home stretched dark and endless. Emma and David had no plans to go out. Instead, they wanted to spend the evening together inside, away from the chill. Their house glowed softly with the flicker of candles that lined the living room, creating a warm and intimate atmosphere. A record played faintly in the background, its steady rhythm filling the silence between them. To an outsider, it would have seemed like nothing more than an ordinary night in the life of a couple deeply in love. But as the hours moved forward, that illusion began to unravel. Emma would later admit that it was David's idea to experiment. He had spoken for weeks about wanting to try LSD, describing it as a way to see the world differently, to break free from ordinary thoughts and routines. For Emma, it wasn't excitement but hesitation that filled her when he brought it up. Drugs had never appealed to her. and she often avoided anything that might make her feel out of control. Still, David's passion had a way of pulling her along. He promised it would be safe, that they would be together, and that nothing bad could happen within the walls of their home. Wanting to trust him, wanting to prove she could share in his adventures, Emma finally agreed. At first, she felt nothing at all. The moments stretched on in comfortable silence, and she thought maybe the experience would pass uneventfully. But soon, the shift began. The shadows of the candle flames no longer seemed fixed. They stretched and swayed like living things. The ceiling above her rippled as though it were made of water. Music that had once been calm and soothing began to echo in her mind with strange urgency. Emma tried to steady her breathing, but the more she focused on reality, the less certain she felt about it. David, in contrast, seemed exhilarated. He laughed freely, moving around the room with bursts of energy. He spoke in broken fragments, ideas tumbling from his mouth too fast for Emma to follow. His face, so familiar to her, appeared to shift under the dim light. His eyes seemed brighter, his smile sharper, almost unnatural. Every time she looked at him, she felt an unsettling twist in her stomach, as though she were staring at someone both known and unknown. The minutes dragged into hours, and Emma's anxiety grew. The walls felt like they were closing in. She thought she heard whispers coming from the corners of the room, voices she could not recognize, murmuring words she couldn't understand. The floor seemed to pulse beneath her feet, each step sending shivers up her body. David tried to reassure her, but his voice no longer sounded like his own. It was distorted, heavy, and threatening in ways she couldn't explain. What had started as a night of trust and curiosity quickly transformed into a spiral of fear. Emma's grip on reality slipped further with every flicker of the candle light. Every distorted note of music, every unfamiliar movement from the man she thought she knew better than anyone. She would later recall fragments of visions, shapes, and figures that seemed to crawl from the walls, pressing closer, surrounding her. And in the center of it all was David, whose presence no longer comforted her but instead filled her with a dread she couldn't shake. The house, once their sanctuary, had become something darker, a place where reality and hallucination blurred together with no clear way out. The first signs that something was wrong came from the neighbors. Those who lived closest to Emma and David's home reported hearing noises just after midnight, sounds that didn't fit the quiet of the countryside. A heavy thud shook the stillness, followed by a sharp crash like glass breaking. Some dismissed it as a fallen branch or an animal scurrying through the woods, but others remembered hearing muffled shouts. One woman swore she heard a scream, cut short before she could tell where it came from. None of them called the police that night, assuming that whatever had happened would resolve itself. By morning, the silence had returned, though it was far from ordinary. Inside the house, Emma sat trembling in the living room, her hands raw with scratches and her eyes wide with shock. The candles had burned down to stubs, their wax hardened across the wooden table. Furniture was overturned, shards of glass littered the floor, and streaks of something dark led toward the back door. Emma's clothes were ripped, and her skin was covered in bruises she couldn't quite explain. When officers arrived later that morning, she spoke quickly, her words tumbling out without order. She told them David had gone outside in the middle of the night, disappearing into the forest. When they pressed her for details, her story shifted. At one moment she claimed he had run. At another she insisted he had been pulled into the trees. Her answers made no sense, but what frightened the officers most was her expression. She looked terrified of something no one else could see. Search teams entered the woods almost immediately. Dogs sniffed the ground near the porch and picked up a scent that carried them into the dense undergrowth. It wasn't too long before they found the first piece of evidence, a torn scrap of David's shirt snagged on a low branch. Not far from it lay a shoe, half buried in damp leaves. The trail of items continued deeper into the forest, as though something had dragged David through the night. Volunteers combed the area, calling his name, their voices swallowed by the trees. The most chilling discovery came near a narrow creek that cut through the woods. A dark stain marked the rocks along the water's edge, confirmed later as blood. The amount was enough to suggest serious injury, but still no body was found. The trail ended abruptly there, as though whatever had happened to David had vanished into thin air. Investigators waded through the water, searched both banks, and even brought in divers to explore the murky depths, but the effort produced nothing. Meanwhile, Emma's condition worsened. She grew increasingly incoherent, shifting between fear, confusion, and moments of complete silence. At times, she whispered that something had taken David, something not human. Sometimes, she just looked at her hands like they were total strangers. Detectives began to suspect that she was withholding the truth, though no one could piece together what had happened between the last sound heard by neighbors and the bloody trail left in the woods. The absence of a body left the investigation suspended in dread. Without answers, rumors spread quickly through the town. Some believed David had been attacked by a wild animal, while others whispered that Emma knew far more than she was admitting. Each passing hour deepened the mystery, and with David still missing, the search carried on with growing urgency. For days after David's disappearance, a volunteer searching beyond the marked perimeter of the forest stumbled upon something in a clearing. At first it looked like discarded clothing tangled in the underbrush, but as he stepped closer, the grim truth revealed itself. David's body lay sprawled on the damp ground, partially concealed by fallen leaves. The scene was horrifying in its detail. His torso bore deep, jagged cuts, and his arms were covered in wounds that suggested desperate attempts to fight back. The discovery confirmed what many had feared. This was no accident, no simple misstep in the woods. Something violent had unfolded. Investigators closed off the area immediately. Forensic teams examined every inch of the clearing, documenting the injuries, collecting soil samples, and photographing the surroundings. There were no tracks from animals nearby, no paw prints, no signs of a struggle with wildlife. Instead, the evidence pointed towards something human. Shards of glass were embedded in David's skin, small fragments that matched the broken candle holders found scattered inside the couple's home. Melted wax was detected in several of the wounds, making it clear that at some point during the struggle, objects from the house had been used to harm him. It was as though the violence had started indoors, then spilled into the night until it ended here in the forest. The brutality of the injuries unsettled the investigators. The cuts did not resemble those from a standard weapon like a knife or axe. They were irregular, as if caused by objects grabbed in desperation. A fragment of ceramic was later recovered from beneath David's fingernails, another clue linking the attack back to the overturned remains of the home. It was a picture of chaos, not a calculated act. When Emma was informed that David had been found, her reaction was unnerving. She wept uncontrollably one moment and fell into eerie silence the next. When questioned, she offered explanations that drifted between confusion and impossibility. At one point she insisted she had seen David transform before her eyes, his face becoming something monstrous. At another, she claimed she had blacked out entirely and awoken to find him gone. Detectives grew more convinced that her erratic state was connected to whatever had happened in the house. Autopsy results deepened the mystery. Toxicology tests revealed no substances in David's system aside from alcohol, eliminating the idea that he had joined Emma in taking LSD. The cause of death was blood loss from multiple sharp force injuries. What puzzled the medical examiner was the pattern. While defensive wounds suggested he had tried to shield himself, the majority of the cuts were on his torso and shoulders, consistent with being attacked at close range. The physical evidence increasingly narrowed the circle back to Emma, yet the investigators couldn't reconcile the savagery of the attack with her fragile demeanor. Nothing about her history suggested violence. She had no record of aggression, no history of lashing out at others. To friends and family, she seemed incapable of such an act. Still, the forensic trail was undeniable. David's final moments were brutal, and the connection to the home he shared with Emma was too strong to dismiss. The discovery in the clearing shifted the investigation from a missing persons case to a homicide, with suspicion now centered squarely on the woman who had been with him that night. After days of conflicting accounts and fragments of evidence, investigators turned their attention fully to Emma. They placed her in a small, stark interview room at the county sheriff's office where cameras recorded every flicker of her expression. At first, she sat stiffly, hands clasped in her lap, her eyes darting from the walls to the floor as though she feared something unseen. When asked directly what had happened on the night David died, her words were hesitant, broken, and contradictory. She repeated that they had planned a quiet evening, that he had encouraged her to take LSD, and that afterward everything blurred. She admitted she could no longer tell what parts of her memory were real and what belonged only to the hallucinations. As the questioning continued, her composure unraveled. She confessed to seeing David's face change into something she didn't recognize, describing it as though the skin had cracked and shifted. She claimed his voice no longer sounded like his own, but instead carried tones that felt threatening, even demonic. In that distorted state of fear, she believed she was fighting for her life against an intruder wearing her fiancé's body. What followed, she insisted, was a haze of motion and terror. She remembered grabbing whatever objects were near her glass, candles, even broken pieces of furniture, but not the specific act of striking him. She said the night fractured into flashes, blood on her hands, shadows moving across the walls, and David falling, only to rise again in forms she could not understand. Forensic analysts matched her description all too well. The injuries on David's body aligned with a chaotic attack using household items. The fragments of glass, the wax pressed into his wounds, the scattered objects throughout the living room, it all spoke of frenzy rather than precision. Yet, frenzy or not, the law saw only one outcome. A man had been killed, and the evidence tied Emma to the act. Her confession, though clouded by delusion, confirmed her role in his death. The case captivated the public. Headlines framed Emma as the LSD bride, a woman who destroyed the man she loved under the weight of a hallucination. Some believed she was a victim herself, consumed by a drug that warped her perception until she could no longer distinguish reality from terror. Others viewed her as reckless, willingly stepping into a dangerous experiment and paying the price with another person's life. The courtroom, when the case eventually reached trial, was filled with both outrage and sympathy. Experts debated whether Emma's state of mind absolved her of responsibility. Psychiatrists explained how powerful hallucinations could distort even the most rational mind, while prosecutors argued that she had made the choice to take the drug and had unleashed violence that could not be excused. Emma remained quiet through much of it, often staring into the distance as though still trapped in the nightmare of that night. In the end, the jury was left to weigh love against horror, choice against consequence. What was certain, and what no verdict could undo, was that a young couple's future had been erased in a single night. What began as an evening of trust and intimacy had collapsed into one of the most disturbing tragedies the town had ever witnessed. Emma's confession ensured she would forever be remembered not as a bride-to-be, but as the central figure in a story where reality slipped away, leaving only blood, fear, and questions that could never be fully answered.